Imagine trying to speak with your lungs trapped, with every breath costing a muscular effort that few human bodies can describe. In crucifixion, victims died partly by asphyxiation. Every word required a brutal physical act of lifting one's own body against the weight of nailed arms. He did this 7 times. He chose 7 moments to spend the remaining air in words. They were not screams. They were not delirious ramblings. They were 7 deliberate statements, spoken in order, with an internal coherence that experts in linguistics, theology, and forensic medicine continue to study 2,000 years later. This is the story of what was said on that Friday, of what each sentence physically cost to pronounce, and of what it meant within the historical, cultural, and textual context in which it was generated. To understand the weight of each of those 7 sentences, you first need to understand the mechanics of what was happening to the body that spoke them. Crucifixion was not invented by the Romans, it was perfected by them. The Persians had practiced executions by impalement on vertical stakes for centuries before. The Carthaginians developed variations, but it was Rome that transformed the method into a science of political control. A public spectacle designed to last, to be seen, to communicate a message to conquered populations. This is what happens to those who defy the empire. The process could take between 6 hours and 4 days, depending on the physical condition of the victim and climatic conditions. Death rarely came from a single cause. It was a combination of hypovolemia from blood loss, traumatic shock, severe dehydration, and, in the final stage, asphyxiation. The respiratory mechanics in a crucifixion are what make every word spoken in that state an extraordinary feat from a medical standpoint. When the body hangs by arms fixed above shoulder level, the intercostal muscles, those that control the expansion of the chest cavity, are under extreme tension. Exhaling is relatively passive, but inhaling enough air to fill the lungs and produce vocalized sound requires the person to push their own weight upward using their legs, temporarily relieving the traction on the arms and allowing the diaphragm to contract. In cases where the feet were nailed, this movement was possible, but devastatingly painful. Each deep breath involved pressing the top of the foot against the nail that pierced it. In cases where there was a suppedaneum, a small wooden platform under the feet, the process was slightly less agonizing, but equally exhausting. The logic of crucifixion as a method of execution by asphyxiation was precisely this. As the hours passed, the victim ran out of muscular strength to continue executing this lifting movement. When the legs could no longer hold, breathing became impossible. This was why soldiers broke the legs of victims when they wanted to accelerate the process, as they did with the 2 men crucified alongside on that day, according to John's account. None of the 4 authors who recorded the events of that day were physicians, but the physical description that emerges from the 4 texts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is consistent with what modern forensic medicine recognizes as the clinical picture of a crucifixion following severe flagellation. The accused had been beaten with a Roman flagrum, a whip with multiple leather strips tipped with pieces of bone and metal, designed to lacerate the skin down to the underlying musculature. He had carried part of the instrument of execution for a distance that the Gospels place between Pilate's Praetorium and Golgotha, outside the city walls. He had been deprived of sleep throughout the entire previous night. He had sweated blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, a phenomenon called hematidrosis, documented in cases of extreme physiological stress, where the capillaries beneath the sweat glands rupture. He arrived at the moment of crucifixion in a state of advanced physical collapse, and yet, in 6 hours suspended between dawn and early afternoon, he opened his mouth 7 times. Each of those 7 sentences was recorded by at least one of the 4 evangelists. None of the 4 recorded all 7. To assemble the complete sequence, You need all four texts combined. And it is in that combination that the architecture of what was said begins to appear with clarity. The first sentence came early. Luke is the only evangelist to record it in chapter 23, verse 34. The process of driving in the nails had just been completed. The soldiers were dividing the garments among themselves. A standard practice. The condemned's belongings were the property of the executioners. The surrounding atmosphere was one of mockery and bureaucratic indifference. And in that moment, before anything else, the first declaration emerged. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. To understand the archaeological weight of this sentence, you need to know the cultural context in which it was spoken. In first-century Jewish thought, the forgiveness of a grave offense was not a unilateral decision by the victim. It was a process that necessarily involved the offender's acknowledgement of the offense, the restitutio in integrum, the reparation of the harm to the extent possible, and only then the declaration of forgiveness. To forgive someone who had not asked for forgiveness, who had not acknowledged the wrong, who was actively in the process of committing the offense, was a radical rupture with the dominant moral logic. Not just Jewish, Roman, Greek, Persian. In all the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean world, forgiveness was a transaction. It required a conscious and willing recipient. The sentence was not directed at those standing around. It was directed to God. Father, forgive them. Not, I forgive them, which would already be extraordinary, but an active intercession, a petition on behalf of the very executioners, formulated at the exact moment of execution. They do not know what they are doing. This clause has generated centuries of theological debate. Was it genuine ignorance? Was it a legal mitigating factor? Was it an assertion about the nature of human violence as structural blindness? New Testament scholars diverge in interpretation, but converge on one point. The sentence is historically without parallel in records of executions from antiquity. There is no other documented case of a victim interceding on behalf of their own executioners at the moment of execution. Physically speaking, this sentence cost the first elevation of the body. The leg muscles pressed against the nail, the diaphragm contracted, air entered, and 12 words came out in Aramaic, because Jesus spoke Aramaic, not classical Hebrew, as evidenced by direct quotations in the Gospels. The second sentence arrived after an interval that the texts do not quantify with precision. Luke records in the same chapter 23 the scene of two men crucified simultaneously, called criminals in the Greek text, kakurgoi, a Roman legal category for high-risk offenders, generally brigands or insurgents. One of them spent part of the time insulting the man crucified in the center, reinforcing the crowd's mockery. The other silenced him, and then made a request, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." The response was the second sentence, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." For the first-century listener, this declaration was laden with layers. The word paradise was not a Hebrew word. It was a transliteration of the Persian peridaisa, which literally meant walled garden, enclosed enclosure. The Persians used it to describe royal gardens, spaces of protected beauty, reserved for royalty and their intimate guests. The word entered Greek through the Greek text of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, where it was used to describe the Garden of Eden, and in some passages as an image of eschatological paradise, the place where the righteous await the resurrection. In intertestamental Jewish thought, there was a lively debate about the geography and timing of paradise. Some traditions placed it in the third heaven. Others placed it as an intermediate state between death and the final resurrection. The promise made to the dying criminal beside him was neither vague nor generic. It was specific in time, today, and specific in destination, with me, not in a place where you will be, but with me. The audacity of the declaration, seen from a historical standpoint, lies in what it implied about the authority of the one who pronounced it. No rabbi, no judge, no prophet of the Old Testament had ever promised someone a place in paradise for a simple verbal request at the moment of death. The Jewish system of atonement involved the temple, sacrifices, purification rituals. The promise was made by someone who was being executed as condemned by the very religious system that was supposed to authorize such things. The third sentence came in a different form than the others. It was not a theological declaration, not an intercession, not an eschatological promise. It was a domestic gesture. John records in chapter 19, verses 26 and 27, that there was a group of women near the cross, among them the mother of Jesus and the disciple called the one he loved, identified by tradition as John himself. Seeing the two of them, the crucified man said to the woman, "Woman, behold your son," and to the disciple, "Behold your mother." In the first century world, this declaration had immediate practical implications. Mary was a widow. Joseph does not appear in any scene of Jesus' adult life, and the majority academic presumption is that he had died. According to Jewish law, the responsibility for caring for a widow fell upon the eldest sons, with the eldest son being publicly executed as a criminal, and the other sons, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, mentioned in Mark 6, verse 3, absent from the scene. Mary's position was vulnerable. The declaration was not poetic. It was an informal legal act, an act of verbal adoption within the structure of familial responsibility in Jewish culture. John records that from that moment on, he took her into his own home. But the additional layer that scholars frequently highlight is what this sentence reveals about the state of consciousness of the one who spoke it. 3 hours into the crucifixion process, with active hemorrhaging from multiple wounds, with the temperature rising as the midday sun of Nisan reached its peak over Jerusalem. And there was a moment of attention turned not toward himself, but toward an elderly woman at the foot of the cross. The emotional and cognitive logic of extreme pain generally produces the opposite: contraction, isolation, absolute focus on one's own survival. What the texts describe is a state of expanded attention turned outward. The fourth sentence is the most studied, the most debated, and the only one that the evangelists record in Aramaic before translating. Matthew in chapter 27 verse 46 and Mark in chapter 15 verse 34 record the exact words, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which both translate as, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This sentence was spoken at the 9th hour, in the Roman reckoning of the day, which began at sunrise around 6 in the morning. The 9th hour corresponded to 3 in the afternoon, 3 hours after the first 3 sentences, therefore. And there is a physical detail recorded by Matthew and Mark that contextualizes what was happening between the 3rd and 4th sentences. From the 6th to the 9th hour, the 3 hours preceding the 4th declaration, there was darkness over all the land. Both evangelists record this phenomenon with a descriptive naturalness that prevented any subsequent romanticization. It is not described as symbol or vision. It is recorded as an atmospheric event with a start time and duration. The 4th sentence is the opening of Psalm 22, a psalm of David written centuries earlier, which any literate first-century Jew would immediately recognize by its first line. This has produced 2 distinct interpretive camps over the centuries. The first camp argues that Jesus was implicitly quoting the entire psalm. The Jewish tradition of oral memorization was such that citing the first line of a text was to invoke the complete text in the listener's mind. Psalm 22 begins in abandonment and ends in triumph. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. If this reading is correct, the 4th sentence is not a cry of despair. It is a coded affirmation of future triumph, communicated in the only code that the literate listeners present could decode. The second interpretive camp takes the sentence at face value, as a genuine expression of desolation, of a felt absence of God, of abandonment experienced in a real and non-performative way. This camp argues that a formulaic cry would not have the emotional power that the texts suggest. The crowd around was confused. Some thought the man was calling for the prophet Elijah, a possible linguistic confusion between Eli and Eliyahu in popular Aramaic. The perplexity of those present is inconsistent with a calmly recognized quotation. What both camps agree on is that the sentence represents the moment of greatest dramatic and theological tension in the entire sequence. The first three sentences were directed outward, to the executioners, to the criminal beside him, to the mother and the disciple. The fourth was directed upward to God and articulated something the previous three had not articulated: the subjective experience of the one who was dying. And what that experience contained was abandonment. Physically, the fourth sentence represented the elevation of the body for the fourth time. But now, after hours of continuous effort, the muscular state was radically different from the first. The lactic acidosis in the leg muscles, the dehydration accelerated by the sun and blood loss, the exhaustion of the respiratory muscles, all of this had accumulated. Each word cost exponentially more than the previous one. The fifth sentence is the shortest of the seven. John is the only one to record it in chapter 19, verse 28, and introduces it with an observation that commentators consider significant. Jesus, knowing that everything was now finished, and so that scripture would be fulfilled, said, "I am thirsty," 2 words in Greek dipso, I am thirsty. John's observation that the sentence was said so that scripture would be fulfilled refers to Psalm 69, verse 21. They put gall in my food and gave me vinegar for my thirst. But the clinical simplicity of the declaration transcends any symbolic dimension. It is impossible to read "I am thirsty" without overlaying on it the medical datum that at that stage of crucifixion following severe flagellation, dehydration was extreme. The process of flagellation alone caused significant fluid loss through the open wounds. Hours of exposure to the sun intensified that loss. The blood flowing from the wounds in the hands and feet represented more lost fluid. The thirst of the fifth sentence was not discomfort. It was the physiological signal of a body operating at the limit of circulatory collapse. The soldiers responded with a gesture that the texts describe with technical precision. They soaked a sponge in posca, the vinegar diluted in water that was the standard drink of Roman soldiers on campaign, cheap, with a sufficiently low pH to kill bacteria and make water relatively safe for consumption, and placed it on a branch of hyssop to reach the condemned man's mouth. Hyssop, Origanum syriacum, grew on the stone walls of Jerusalem, and its branches could reach between 60 and 90 centimeters, sufficient length for the scene described by John. The detail of the hyssop is one of those elements that scholars of the historicity of the Gospels frequently cite as a marker of authenticity. It is a narratively unnecessary detail, too specific to be retroactive invention. The sixth sentence came immediately after contact with the liquid. John records, in verse 30 of the same chapter, when he had received the vinegar, Jesus said, "It is finished," and bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. 2 words in Greek, tetelestai, it is finished. The Greek term tetelestai, from the verb teleo, to complete, to finalize, to perfect, had precise uses in the commercial and juridical world of the 1st century. When a debt was paid in full, the receipt received the stamp tetelestai. Paid, closed, nothing more owed. When a judicial sentence was carried out in full, the record received the same term. Egyptian papyri from the Roman period, found by archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries, document this commercial usage with precision. The word was not poetic or vague. It was technical terminology for the complete closure of an obligation. What exactly was being declared as finished is the question that has divided interpretive traditions for 2 millennia. The Orthodox Christian interpretation is clear. The atoning work, the substitutionary sacrifice for humanity, had been completed. But even outside that specific theological reading, the minimum content of the declaration is recognizable. Whoever pronounced it considered that they had reached a point of conclusion, not failure, not interruption, conclusion. Tetelestai is not the word someone uses when they are being defeated. It is the word someone uses when they have finished what they came to do. From the standpoint of the internal narrative sequence of the 7 sentences, the 6th occupies a structurally distinct position. The 5 before it were directed to others, to God, to the executioners, to the criminal beside him, to the mother, to the disciple, to God again. The 5th was directed indirectly through physical need. The 6th was not directed to anyone specifically. It was a declaration, an affirmation made to the air, for the record, for whoever was listening or would listen afterward. The 7th and final sentence came last. Luke records it in chapter 23, verse 46. Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. This sentence is almost a direct quotation from Psalm 31, verse 5. "Into your hands I commit my spirit. Deliver me, Lord, my faithful God." Psalm 31 was a prayer of trust in the midst of persecution. Jewish scholars of the intertestamental period document that this was one of the prayers that fathers taught children to pray before sleep, a nightly prayer of surrender, of releasing control and entrusting one's sleep into the hands of God. That this sentence would have been placed in the mouth of a child growing up in Nazareth to pray before sleeping, and that this same sentence was the last one spoken on the cross, is the kind of detail that both biblical and literary scholars cite when analyzing the internal coherence of the texts. But there is an additional element that Luke records, which sets the 7th sentence apart from the previous ones. He called it an exclamation in a loud voice. The Greek is phonzasphon megal. He cried out with a loud voice, with a great voice. It was not whispered, it was proclaimed at volume. This directly contradicts what the physiology of a crucifixion in its final stage normally produces: reduced voice, shallow breathing, semi-consciousness. Luke is recording something he considered notable enough to specify. The last sentence was not murmured, it was spoken with force. Mark records the same detail, a great cry before death, without recording the words. The combination of the 2 texts suggests that the volume was real and observable, confirmed by 2 independent testimonies. And then John records the gesture that accompanied the last words, bowing his head. The Greek is klino, an active, not passive, movement. It was not the head falling from lack of muscular strength, which is what happens when a victim loses consciousness. It was a deliberate movement, like someone laying their head down to sleep. After 7 sentences spoken over 6 hours, the last recorded gesture was this: a voluntary inclination, a conscious rest. The immediate effects that followed were recorded by the 4 evangelists with varying degrees of detail. The temple veil tore from top to bottom, a fabric that Jewish tradition described as a handspan thick and a height equivalent to the interior of the temple, which separated the Holy of Holies, the space where only the high priest entered once a year on Yom Kippur, from the rest of the sanctuary. Matthew records an earthquake and apparitions, elements that generations of commentators have treated with different degrees of literalness. But the detail that all 4 evangelists converge in recording is the reaction of the Roman centurion, the officer responsible for the execution. In Mark, Truly this man was the Son of God. In Luke, surely this man was innocent. A Roman execution officer who had supervised dozens or hundreds of crucifixions throughout his career said something about this particular condemned man that he said about no other. All four texts converge on this detail. There is an element frequently overlooked in the analysis of the 7 sentences, what was not said. In 6 hours of the process, there is no record of a single word of self-pity. There are no words about the disciples who fled, about Judas who betrayed him, about Peter who denied him 3 times just hours before. There are no words asking for miraculous intervention, no words of repentance, no words of cursing against those responsible for the condemnation. Caiaphas, Pilate, the Sanhedrin. What was left out is as revealing as what went in. The distribution of the 7 sentences across the 4 Gospels also has a logic that scholars have documented for centuries. Luke records 3 of them, the first, the second, and the 7th. John records 3, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 6th. Matthew and Mark each record only the 4th, the declaration of abandonment, and they do so with the original Aramaic words preserved before the translation, a marker of authenticity that commentators frequently cite because inventors of a narrative tend to soften the most disturbing elements, not preserve them in 2 languages. That the most theologically disturbing of the 7 sentences is the only one recorded by 2 authors in Aramaic before being translated is a textual datum that is not neutral. The set of 7 sentences assembled from the 4 texts reveals a progression that is not random. The first looks outward to the executioners. The second looks sideways to the criminal beside him. The third looks downward to those at the foot. The fourth looks upward to God and articulates abandonment. The 5th turns inward to the body itself. The 6th declares conclusion. The 7th surrenders control. There is a trajectory from outside to inside, from others to self, from present to eternal, from action to rest. No fiction screenwriter would construct a death scene like this. The structure is too good to be accidental and too specific to be later invention. Inventors of martyrs construct deaths with incendiary speeches, with moments of visible triumph, with impressed witnesses in catharsis. What the 4 texts construct together is different. A sequence of 7 sentences, each costing a brutal physical act, distributed across different testimonies without apparent coordination, composing an architecture that only becomes visible when you place them in order. From the standpoint of the mechanics of execution, each of those 7 sentences was an act of physical resistance. Speaking on the cross was not passive. It was a brutal, muscular choice made repeatedly in a progression of weakening. What draws the attention of those who study these records is not only the content of what was said, it is the sequence. There is a clear progression, from other to self, from external to internal, from present to eternal, as if those hours had an architecture. No fiction screenwriter would construct a death scene like this. 7 declarations, each deeper than the one before, ending not in a scream, but in a deliberate surrender. It is this strangeness that has kept historians, theologians, and skeptics returning to the same text for 2,000 years.